The dashboard clock glowed 8:42 a.m. when Elias Croft guided his sedan into a parking space outside the municipal courthouse in Havenwood, North Carolina. Through the windshield, the warm morning sun threw long, distorted shadows across the dark asphalt, and Elias released a slow, controlled breath, feeling the familiar sting of tardiness. Punctuality was the bedrock of his world as a federal prosecutor, a life built on the unshakable pillars of discipline and meticulous preparation. Today, however, the universe had conspired to test that foundation. It was meant to be a straightforward morning, dedicated to the mundane yet necessary task of challenging a glaring error in a property tax adjustment on the home his grandmother had willed to him. The city's inexplicable tax hike had forced him to spend weeks compiling irrefutable proof of their mistake. That house was far more than mere real estate. It was the very heart of his childhood, the sacred ground where his grandmother's steady gaze had taught him the fundamental difference between right and wrong. Dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit and a crisp white shirt, Elias embodied the image of the seasoned attorney he was, a stark contrast to the chaotic morning he had just endured. A sudden urgent call concerning an active human trafficking investigation had thrown his schedule into disarray. The defense had launched a last-minute motion, a strategic grenade he could not afford to ignore. He had swiftly analyzed the document, relayed his guidance to his team, and then raced to the courthouse, acutely aware that the clock was his enemy. As he ascended the imposing courthouse steps, his phone vibrated with an incoming message. A quick glance revealed a warning from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's Office. The judge in Havenwood has a reputation for being merciless with latecomers. Tread carefully. Elias let out a soft sigh, slipping the phone into his briefcase. He felt no real alarm. Facts were his chosen weapon, and he came fully armed. Yet a strange premonition from the message lingered in the back of his mind. He shook it away as he stepped from the bright sunlight into the cool, dim interior of the building. The municipal court was a world away from the polished federal halls where Elias spent his days. Here the walls were a lifeless beige, the wooden seats worn smooth by decades of anxious bodies. A faint, cloying scent of stale coffee and old paper hung in the air. Despite its frayed appearance, the space pulsed with a nervous energy. People moved in a constant, shuffling current, their arms laden with stacks of papers, their faces masks of worry over parking fines, minor squabbles, and the small-stakes dramas of civil claims. Elias checked his watch. 8:50 a.m. He had 10 minutes. Just enough time. Following the faded signs down a narrow corridor, he passed clusters of people murmuring in hushed, urgent tones. Room 204. The name Judge Alistair Finch was etched into a brass plate on the door. Elias straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. The courtroom was already buzzing with attendees. He found an empty seat near the back, settling in and opening his folder to give his evidence one final review. As his eyes scanned the meticulously organized notes, he saw the judge sweep into the room. Judge Alistair Finch, a tall man with a shock of silver hair and eyes the color of ice, radiated an authority that required no words. His reputation as a stern, no-nonsense figure was immediately apparent in the way his sharp gaze swept across the room, missing nothing. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed. The room rustled to its feet as one. Elias stood with them, his posture ramrod straight. As the judge took his seat, a heavy, expectant silence fell over the room. Judge Finch began to call the cases, one after another, with a cold, mechanical precision, his voice crisp and devoid of emotion. Elias observed intently as a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit hurried in a few minutes late, slipping into a seat without drawing any notice. Moments later, a young woman in jeans and a t-shirt also crept in, finding a place to sit. Neither of them earned so much as a glance from the judge. Elias filed the observation away, turning his focus back to his own impending case. Finally, at 9:15 a.m., Elias heard his name called. He gathered his folder and walked toward the podium, projecting an aura of calm that belied the morning's delay. As he neared the front, Judge Finch looked up, and his expression visibly hardened. Elias felt the atmosphere in the room shift. a subtle but palpable tension that had been absent just moments before. "You're late, Mr. Croft." The judge's voice was a sharp blade, cutting through the quiet hum of the room. "Do you believe the court's time is somehow less valuable than your own?" Elias slightly raised his hand, his palm open in a universal gesture of appeasement. "Your Honor, I sincerely apologize for the delay. I was attending to an urgent federal matter." The judge sliced him off mid-sentence. "Excuses do not absolve you of tardiness. This court functions on order and respect. If you are incapable of following its basic tenets, I suggest you reevaluate your professional priorities." Elias could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room land on him. He held his composure, carefully selecting his next words. "Your Honor, I fully understand the importance of timeliness. If I may, I would like to present my case concerning the property tax adjustment." Judge Finch waved a hand in a gesture of pure dismissal. "We will get to that. First, we must address the matter of contempt. Your tardiness undermines the very integrity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $750. The words hung in the air, heavy and final, like the strike of a gavel on an anvil. Elias's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly, but his face remained a neutral mask. Around him, a wave of quiet murmurs rippled through the gallery. "Your Honor," Elias began again, his tone perfectly calm and measured, "may I please explain the circumstances?" The judge lifted his gavel, silencing him before he could continue. "You may not. Consider this an expensive lesson in respecting the court." Elias stepped back from the podium, his mind racing. This was not simply about being late. This was about something else, something deeper, something he suspected many others in this room had witnessed before. He cast a brief glance toward the other latecomers, neither of whom had faced any reprimand. The disparity was not just obvious, it was glaring. As he walked back to his seat, Elias opened his folder again, but this time his focus was not on the property tax documents. He began to write, his pen flying across a blank page, capturing every detail. The judge, meanwhile, moved on to the next case, his voice as steady and unwavering as before. Elias Croft knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was no longer an ordinary morning. Elias remained seated in the back row, his mind a storm of strategic calculations and pointed observations. The courtroom's rhythm continued, case after case, but he could not escape the raw, blatant disparity he had just experienced. He replayed the instant Judge Finch delivered the $750 fine, contrasting the cold fury directed at him with the complete indifference shown to the others who had arrived even later. The young woman who had quietly entered earlier was now near the front, casually scrolling through her phone, entirely untouched by judicial wrath. A man in a tweed blazer, now presenting his own case, had undeniably walked in well after the session had begun. Yet the judge's ire had been reserved for Elias alone. This was not a random occurrence. It was a pattern, one Elias recognized as clearly as the legal statutes he had sworn to uphold. He engaged his prosecutorial instincts, dissecting the situation with cold precision. A fine of this magnitude for simple tardiness in a municipal setting was not just extreme. It felt punitive. He absorbed the reactions of the people around him, a subtle tapestry of disbelief, discomfort, and raw curiosity. Elias sensed that others in the room were drawing the same conclusions, but they remained silent, cowed by the authority of the bench. "Next case," Judge Finch's voice cut through the air. Elias's name was called once more. He rose, his steps measured and deliberate, as he made his way back to the podium. The judge locked eyes with him, that same piercing gaze challenging him to show any sign of weakness. Elias began, his voice steady. "Your Honor, I have with me detailed documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment. This property has been in my family for generations, and these new adjustments are wildly inconsistent with the city's own assessed values." He laid the folder on the podium, opening it to reveal the neatly organized documents, charts, and photographs within. He pointed to a specific page. This document shows the original tax assessment, which remained stable for 5 consecutive years. The new adjustment, however, represents a 30% increase, levied without any proper notification or justification. Judge Finch leaned back, his posture radiating a profound disinterest. "I will review your documents in due time, Mr. Croft. However, your flagrant tardiness this morning is an issue we simply cannot overlook. Do you genuinely believe that the demands of your federal duties grant you a license to disrespect this court?" Elias's composure was a fortress. "Your Honor, I intended no disrespect. My delay was the direct result of a federal case involving human trafficking, a matter I trust we can all agree requires immediate and unwavering attention." The judge's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, but his tone remained unyielding. "Your priorities, however noble you believe them to be, do not excuse the breaking of rules. Court procedures are in place for a reason." It was not the words themselves that struck Elias. It was the unspoken subtext of dismissal, the implicit message that his explanation, his very standing, was insufficient. His professional record, his character, his genuine effort to respect the system, none of it seemed to matter in this room. Elias took a slow, deliberate breath, allowing the silence to stretch. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of rules. I must, however, ask, are these rules applied equally to every single person who enters this courtroom?" A palpable ripple of unease washed through the gallery. The judge visibly stiffened, a dark flush rising in his cheeks. "Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Croft?" "I am asking for clarity," Elias replied, his voice calm and even. "It is vital to ensure that fairness is not just a concept, but a practice upheld for everyone here." The judge's gavel cracked down sharply on the wood. "I will not tolerate such accusations against this court. Your fine stands." Elias inclined his head in a gesture of acknowledgment, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Your Honor." He returned to his seat, feeling the intense gaze of the entire courtroom upon him. He could sense the quiet admiration from some and the fearful apprehension from others. This was not the first time Elias had faced bias masquerading as authority, but something about this moment felt different, charged. The energy in the room was electric, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what he would do next. Elias discreetly pulled out his phone and began typing notes. He was not finished. Not by a long shot. He made a quiet, firm decision in that moment. This would not end here. The courtroom resumed its mundane routine, but Elias's challenge had irrevocably shifted the atmosphere. Others felt it, too. An older black man sitting 2 rows ahead of him turned just enough to offer a brief, knowing nod of solidarity. The court clerk, her fingers usually a blur across the keyboard, now hesitated, her discomfort visible. When the session finally concluded, Elias lingered for a moment as people began to file out. He watched them, observing how they carried the unspoken weight of what they had just witnessed. A young law student in the corner was scribbling furiously in a notebook, her face a mixture of awe and fierce determination. Elias left the courtroom with his briefcase in hand, a detailed plan already taking shape in his mind. This was no longer about a property tax error or even a punitive fine. This was about something much, much larger. This was about a principle he could not and would not ignore. As Elias stepped out of the courthouse, the crisp morning air did little to dispel the tension that clung to him like a shroud. The building hummed with the ordinary motions of justice, but inside Elias's mind a critical decision was crystallizing. He paused on the courthouse steps, his gaze fixed on his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for his supervising U.S. attorney. "No," he muttered to himself. "Not yet." He stepped to the side, reviewing his notes one more time. The interactions he had witnessed, the disparity he had personally experienced in Judge Finch's courtroom, painted an unmistakable picture. This wasn't an accident. It was a system. Elias's prosecutorial instincts screamed that he now held the seeds of a case far more significant than property taxes or his own mistreatment. Back inside his car, Elias opened his briefcase and retrieved his badge and credentials. The Federal Prosecutor's emblem, embossed in brilliant gold, caught the sunlight streaming through his windshield. This, he decided, would be his first move. By the time he re-entered the courtroom, the morning's docket had mostly concluded. The room was quieter now, though a few people still lingered, shuffling papers or waiting for their turn. Judge Finch was at the bench, leafing through a stack of documents, his demeanor calm but tinged with visible fatigue. Elias walked with purpose toward the bench, his badge and identification held ready in his hand. As he approached the podium, the court clerk's head snapped up, her fingers frozen mid-keystroke. Judge Finch glanced up, his previous irritation returning in an instant. "Mr. Croft, the court session is over. If you have additional business, you will need to schedule an appointment," the judge stated curtly. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Elias began, his voice imbued with a quiet, unshakable authority, "I believe it is imperative that I formally introduce myself." He held his badge up just enough for it to be clearly visible to everyone left in the room. "My name is Elias Croft. I am an assistant United States attorney for the Northern District of North Carolina. I have been with the Department of Justice for over a decade, specializing in cases of human trafficking, public corruption, and civil rights violations." The judge froze, his hands motionless over the papers before him. The color drained from his face as the weight of Elias's words settled in the room. The few remaining spectators watched, their expressions shifting from idle curiosity to rapt attention. "I was late this morning," Elias continued, his tone firm yet respectful, "because I was addressing an urgent matter in a federal case that required my immediate intervention. And while I fully appreciate the importance of court procedures, I could not help but notice a significant disparity in how individuals were treated in this courtroom today." The judge's lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. "Mr. Croft, if you feel there was some procedural error, you are welcome to file a formal complaint." "I have already begun documenting this morning's events," Elias replied, holding up his notebook. "Not just my own treatment, but the dramatically different responses to other latecomers, particularly those that appear to fall along racial lines. As an officer of the court, I am professionally and morally obligated to report any pattern of bias or discrimination I witness." Judge Finch leaned back, a flicker of unease in his icy eyes. "Are you accusing this court of misconduct, Mr. Croft?" "I am stating what I observed, Your Honor," Elias said calmly. "As a federal prosecutor, I have dedicated my entire career to ensuring that justice is applied equally, regardless of who stands before the bench. What I witnessed here today raises serious and profound concerns." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The court clerk glanced nervously from Elias to the judge, her hands hovering uselessly over her keyboard. The young law student in the back corner was writing with a frantic intensity, her eyes wide with the significance of the moment. The judge cleared his throat, a desperate attempt to reclaim his authority. "This court takes such matters with the utmost seriousness. If you believe there was an error in judgment, I suggest you address it through the appropriate channels." Elias placed his badge and identification on the podium. "I fully intend to, Your Honor. But I also believe this moment presents an opportunity for reflection on how we all can better ensure that the principles of fairness and equality are truly upheld in every courtroom." "Every day." Judge Finch shifted in his high-backed chair, his hands gripping the armrests. He had presided over this room for decades, his word rarely, if ever, questioned so directly. For the first time, it seemed, his formidable confidence was faltering. "You may go, Mr. Croft," the judge said, his voice now noticeably quieter. Elias collected his credentials and turned to leave, but not before delivering one final pointed statement. "Thank you, Your Honor. I will ensure this matter is addressed properly." As Elias Croft walked out of the courtroom for the second time that day, he felt the eyes of every person left in the room following him. The gravity of the moment was not lost on him. This was never just about standing up for himself. It was about challenging a system that too often and too conveniently failed to see its own deeply ingrained flaws. Outside, Elias pulled out his phone and began composing a detailed email to his superiors. He included every observation, every piece of dialogue, and every instance of disparity he had witnessed. By the time he pressed send, he knew this was only the beginning. The email Elias dispatched that afternoon traveled with a speed and impact that even he hadn't fully anticipated. By the following morning, his phone was buzzing with a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office. His supervisor, Anya Sharma, a formidable attorney with decades of hard-won experience, spoke with a voice that was a mix of sharp urgency and deep intrigue. "Elias, I've read your report," she said, her tone leaving no room for pleasantries. "If what you're describing is accurate, this isn't just a one-off incident. This could be indicative of systemic bias." "I believe it is," Elias replied, his voice firm. "What happened yesterday was not subtle. It's a pattern I've seen in other forms before, and I am certain I'm not the only person who has experienced it in that courtroom." Anya let out a sharp breath. "I'll contact the Judicial Review Commission. This needs to be handled with surgical precision, but it needs to be handled. In the meantime, I want you to gather every piece of documentation you can find. If this breaks publicly, we need an ironclad case." The call ended, but for Elias, the work was just starting. He dedicated hours to meticulously piecing together every detail from that session in the municipal court. He delved into public records, quickly identifying glaring inconsistencies in the fines and penalties handed down by Judge Finch. Disturbing patterns began to crystallize from the data. Fines for minor infractions were consistently and significantly higher for black defendants, while white defendants frequently received mere warnings or substantially reduced penalties. Elias began to reach out to his network of colleagues and community contacts, connecting with other attorneys who had appeared before Judge Finch. The response was a deluge. Stories of disparate and unfair treatment poured in. Some shared in hushed, fearful confidence. Others offered with a bold, righteous defiance. A young black woman recounted being hit with a crippling fine for a simple parking violation, while a white man with a history of multiple offenses was let off with a nominal fee. Another attorney described how the judge would habitually interrupt black defendants, rarely permitting them to present their cases fully. Within a matter of days, the Judicial Review Commission launched a formal inquiry. Investigators descended upon the Havenwood courthouse, requesting years of case files and conducting interviews with the staff. The court clerk, a nervous woman named Mrs. Gable, proved to be a pivotal source. With trembling hands, she produced a small, worn notebook she had kept hidden in her desk drawer for years. "These are just notes I've been taking," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "Every time something felt wrong, I wrote it down. I've always been too afraid to say anything, but I can't stay silent anymore." The notebook was a damning chronicle of injustice. Dates, names, and specific instances of unequal treatment were meticulously recorded. Investigators also spoke with Marcus Cole, the courtroom's longtime bailiff. He shared his own observations with a quiet, resolute conviction. "I've been working here for 15 years, Cole stated. "I've seen how the judge treats people differently based on who they are. I always knew it wasn't right, but I never thought there was anything I could do about it." Meanwhile, the story began to seep into the local community. The young law student who had witnessed the tense exchange in the courtroom posted a detailed, moment-by-moment account on social media. Within hours, it went viral, sparking a firestorm of outrage and a flood of similar personal testimonies. The headlines were not far behind. "Bias in Havenwood Courtroom, Federal Prosecutor Challenges Judge's Conduct." News outlets seized the story. And Elias found himself at the epicenter of a rapidly growing storm. Calls from reporters became a constant interruption, but he deflected them all, choosing to remain laser-focused on the official investigation. The mounting pressure began to visibly wear on Judge Finch. Rumors swirled that he had been summoned to a series of tense, closed-door meetings with judicial oversight committees. Though he continued to publicly deny any wrongdoing privately, the gravity of the situation was beginning to dawn on him. By the end of that first week, Elias received another call from Anya. "The preliminary findings are staggering," she said, her voice grim. "The numbers don't lie, Elias. Black defendants in his courtroom have been fined at a rate 3 times higher than white defendants for the exact same infractions." It's systemic. "What's the next step?" Elias asked. "We're taking this to the State Judicial Board," Anya confirmed. "And Elias, the media is not going to let this go. Be prepared." Elias nodded to himself, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. This was bigger than he could have ever imagined, but he had absolutely no intention of backing down. The story of Elias Croft's confrontation with Judge Finch had exploded far beyond the city limits of Havenwood. By the end of the second week, national media outlets had seized upon the case. Headlines like "Systemic Bias Unveiled," "Federal Prosecutor Takes a Stand," dominated the news cycle. On social media, hashtags such as "Equal Justice Now" and "Bias in the Courts" trended for days, with thousands of people sharing their own painful experiences of courtroom discrimination. Elias remained steadfastly focused, working in close collaboration with the Judicial Review Commission to consolidate the mounting evidence. The findings were devastatingly clear. Over the past 5 years, Judge Finch had fined black defendants, on average 300% more than white defendants, for similar offenses. Late arrivals by white defendants were frequently ignored, while black defendants faced public reprimands or steep financial penalties. Even simple requests for leniency, like establishing payment plans for fines, were disproportionately denied to minority defendants. The evidence was not merely statistical, it was profoundly human. Former defendants began to come forward, some speaking publicly, others providing anonymous testimony to share their stories. A black mother recounted how she was fined $500 for contesting a minor zoning issue, despite presenting clear evidence that the city was at fault. A young man described the deep humiliation he felt as the judge publicly questioned his work ethic, only to dismiss a nearly identical case from a white defendant just minutes later. Local activist groups soon joined the cause, organizing rallies and demanding accountability. Outside the Havenwood courthouse, protesters gathered with signs that read, "Justice should be blind," and "End bias now." Elias deliberately avoided the public spectacle, but he could not ignore the immense significance of what was unfolding. Inside the courthouse, the pressure was becoming unbearable. Staff members who had worked under Judge Finch for years started to share their own long-suppressed observations. Mrs. Gable, the clerk, became a central figure in the investigation. Her meticulously detailed notes, when combined with official court records, painted a comprehensive and damning picture of bias that stretched back decades. "I never really thought anyone would listen," she admitted during an interview with investigators. "But now that it's all coming to light, I know I can't stay silent any longer." Even Marcus Cole, the bailiff, spoke up publicly. In a formal statement to the commission, he affirmed, "I have witnessed this kind of treatment for years. It's wrong, and it is long past time for something to be done about it." Judge Finch, meanwhile, found himself increasingly cornered and isolated. While he had initially dismissed the accusations as simple misinterpretations, the overwhelming weight of the evidence forced him into a defensive crouch. In a rare public statement, he expressed a hollow regret for any unintentional actions that may have caused harm. The words rang empty against the mountain of proof to the contrary. Elias, though inundated with media requests and messages of support, stayed grounded. He continued his demanding work as a federal prosecutor, knowing his responsibilities were far greater than this single case. At the same time, he couldn't ignore the flood of communication pouring into his office. Emails, phone calls, and letters arrived from every corner of the country. Some offered unwavering support, while others shared eerily similar stories of bias in other courtrooms. One particularly poignant letter came from a retired attorney in Alabama. "For years, I saw the same injustices you are describing, but I never spoke up," he wrote. "Thank you for having the courage to do what so many of us could not." The movement for reform grew beyond Havenwood. Other judges in North Carolina began to face intense scrutiny as activists and reporters started digging into their court records. The state's Judicial Oversight Committee announced a broad, sweeping review of all municipal courts, vowing to root out systemic bias wherever it was found. By the end of the month, the Judicial Review Commission completed its preliminary report. The findings were unequivocal, and the implications were clear. Judge Finch's actions were part of a larger, deeply embedded problem. The report called for immediate and sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training for all judges, regular audits of court decisions, and the establishment of independent citizen oversight committees. The pressure finally became too much for Judge Finch to bear. Faced with the certainty of a public hearing and the high probability of disciplinary action, he announced his immediate resignation. In a brief, terse statement, he said, "I believe it is in the best interest of this court and this community that I step aside." Wall, ma'am. The announcement was met with a complex mix of reactions. Some saw it as a clear admission of guilt, while others viewed it as a necessary first step toward healing and rebuilding trust. For Elias, it was a moment of profound vindication, but not one of celebration. The resignation was just the beginning. The real difficult work lay ahead. As the first waves of reform began to take shape, Elias Croft found himself cast in a new and unexpected role. He was invited to speak at law schools, community forums, and legal conferences, sharing his experience and speaking on the critical importance of challenging systemic bias. His story became a source of inspiration for a new generation of young lawyers, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, who began to see themselves as powerful agents for change. At one such event, a young black law student approached Elias after his speech. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules and statutes, it's about people," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You've given me a reason to fight for real justice." Elias smiled, humbled by her words. "The fight is just beginning," he replied. "But if we all do our part, we can make the system better for everyone." 3 months after the morning that had set everything in motion, the courthouse in Havenwood was visibly transformed. The tired beige walls had been repainted in a warm, welcoming color, and a new information desk greeted visitors as they entered. Signs in multiple languages now directed people to vital resources they had never known were available before: information on payment plans, free legal aid, and guides to court procedures. A small but significant plaque had been installed near the entrance, its words simple and clear: "Equal justice is everyone's right." Inside the courthouse, the changes were even more profound. Judge Finch was gone, having quietly retired from the bench following his resignation. In his place sat a younger judge, a woman with a strong reputation for fairness and impartiality. More importantly, systemic reforms were already being implemented. All court personnel, from judges to clerks, were now required to attend intensive bias training led by experts who tackled the subtle, insidious ways discrimination could seep into the decision-making process. Elias stood at the back of the newly renovated courtroom, his eyes scanning the room. He had been invited to speak to a group of local judges and lawyers about the changes that had been put into place. As he waited for his turn at the podium, he felt a complex mixture of pride and cautious optimism. Change had truly begun, but he knew there was still a long, arduous road ahead. The reforms extended far beyond Havenwood. Inspired by Elias's courageous stand, other communities in North Carolina and eventually across the nation began to reevaluate their own court systems. State judicial review boards implemented mandatory audits of case outcomes with a specific focus on identifying and addressing racial and socioeconomic disparities. New oversight committees, composed of a diverse mix of legal experts, community advocates, and former defendants, were established to monitor court proceedings and ensure true accountability. In Elias's own office, the momentum was palpable. The notice for his fine from that fateful morning now hung framed on his wall, not as a trophy of victory, but as a stark, constant reminder of why he had chosen to take a stand. Below it was a photograph from a recent event, a group of bright-eyed law students who had started a civil rights clinic in his honor. Their smiles radiated a powerful hope, and Elias couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility toward the next generation of legal minds. In the community, the ripple effects were equally significant. Marcus Cole, the veteran bailiff who had served under Judge Finch, was now leading bias training sessions for new court officers. At one of his sessions, he addressed a room filled with recruits. "Our job isn't just to keep order," he told them, his voice resonating with conviction. "It's to ensure that every single person who steps into this room is treated with dignity and respect. If you see something that's wrong, you speak up. Silence is complicity." Mrs. Gable, the court clerk whose meticulous records had been instrumental in the investigation, had been promoted to oversee a new program focused on promoting ethical court practices. She worked tirelessly, mentoring younger clerks and ensuring that the grave mistakes of the past would never be repeated. Elias's influence extended beyond the legal community as well. He began teaching a popular seminar at a nearby law school, focusing on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary. His students, many of whom were directly inspired by his story, often stayed long after class to ask how they could make a real difference. One afternoon, a student approached him with a notebook filled with ideas for reform. "What do you think is the most important thing we can do to make the system fairer?" she asked. Elias thought for a moment before responding. "Listen," he said. "Listen to each other, listen to the people who come through our courts, and especially listen to those who are too afraid to speak up. Listening is where real change always begins." The changes were not without resistance. Some judges and attorneys bristled at the new oversight measures, claiming they undermined their authority. But the data was undeniable. Within a year, statistics showed a significant decrease in racial disparities in fines and sentences in Havenwood's municipal court. Payment plans were approved more often, and defendants reported feeling they were treated with far more respect. For Elias, the most rewarding moments came from the ordinary people who approached him simply to share their stories. An elderly black man who had been in the courtroom that morning months ago returned to the courthouse just to thank him. "I've been coming to this place for 40 years, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen so much injustice in these walls. I never thought I'd see the day when someone finally stood up and said, 'Enough. Thank you for giving us hope.'" One morning, Elias received a letter in his office. It was from a young public defender in Chicago who had read about his story and been inspired to launch her own investigation into biases within her local courts. The letter ended with a simple but powerful line. "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place." Elias read the letter twice before placing it in a folder he had labeled Impact. He leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. It was never about him. This was about the countless voices that had been silenced or ignored for far too long, voices that were finally at long last being heard. Months later, Elias walked back into the courthouse where it had all begun. He wasn't there for a case or an investigation. He had been invited to be the keynote speaker at the unveiling of a new judicial ethics center, named in part to honor his efforts. As he stepped to the podium, he looked out at the assembled crowd. Judges, lawyers, clerks, and community members filled the room, their faces a mix of anticipation and gratitude. "Justice isn't just about laws written in books," Elias began, his voice clear and strong. "It's about how we treat the human beings who come into our courtrooms. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect. And it's about ensuring that every single person, no matter who they are or where they come from, knows that their voice matters." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Elias's focus was on the faces in the crowd. In them, he saw hope. He saw determination, and he saw the powerful beginnings of real, lasting change. And he knew that, while the work was far from over, this was a momentous step in the right direction.